The wail of sirens pierced through our quiet suburban evening like a knife through silk. I was holding my wife Sarah's hand as she lay pale and trembling on our living room couch, her breathing shallow and labored. The chest pains had started an hour ago, and what began as mild discomfort had escalated into something that made my blood run cold. "They're here," I whispered, squeezing her hand gently. Through our front window, I could see the red and blue lights painting our manicured lawn in alternating colors of urgency. The ambulance had arrived in record time, 7 minutes from my 911 call. But something was wrong. The ambulance sat motionless at our community gate, its lights flashing desperately but going nowhere. I could see the paramedics gesticulating wildly through the windshield, clearly frustrated. My heart sank as I realized what was happening. Our homeowners association had installed new security gates 6 months ago, and with them came new rules. Rules that someone was apparently enforcing. Even now, even when life hung in the balance. "What's taking so long?" Sarah managed to whisper, her voice barely audible. I kissed her forehead, tasting the salt of cold sweat. "Just hold on, honey. They'll be here any second." But even as I said it, I could see through the window that the ambulance wasn't moving. Instead, I watched in growing horror as a familiar silver SUV pulled up behind the ambulance and parked directly in its path. My stomach dropped as I recognized the vehicle, and, more importantly, its driver. Karen Middlesworth, our HOA board member and self-appointed guardian of neighborhood regulations, stepped out of her SUV like she was walking into a boardroom meeting, rather than blocking emergency medical services. Even from our living room window, I could see her crossing her arms and shaking her head at the ambulance crew. "Oh no," I muttered under my breath. "What is it?" Sarah asked, trying to sit up. "Nothing, sweetheart. Just stay calm." But inside, I was anything but calm. I knew Karen's reputation. She was the woman who had homeowners towed for parking 17 inches from the curb instead of 18. She was the one who measured grass, height with a ruler, and issued violations for lawns that were a quarter inch too long. She was notorious for interpreting HOA rules with the rigidity of a military drill sergeant and the compassion of a tax collector. And now she stood between my dying wife and the help she desperately needed. Through the glass, I watched Karen approach. The ambulance driver's window, her perfectly coiffed blonde hair not moving despite the evening breeze. She was wearing her standard uniform, khaki capris, a white polo shirt, and that unmistakable air of authority that she wielded like a weapon. The ambulance driver rolled down his window, and I could see his mouth moving rapidly, probably explaining the medical emergency. But Karen simply shook her head and pointed back toward the gate. Even from 200 yards away, I could read her body language. Rules are rules. No exceptions. My wife's hand tightened around mine. "I don't feel good," she whispered. "Really not good." I looked down at her ashen face, then back at the standoff by the gate. The ambulance lights continued their desperate dance, casting shadows that seemed to mock the urgency of our situation. Every second that ticked by was a second stolen from Sarah's chances. That's when I saw Karen pull out her phone, not to call for help or clarification, but to take photos. She was documenting the ambulance's unauthorized presence at our community entrance, building her case for what she probably saw as a violation of HOA protocols. My hands clenched into fists. For 23 years, I had served my country with honor, discipline, and an unwavering commitment to protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. I had kept my military bearing, my composure, and my respect for chain of command, even in the most impossible situations. But watching Karen Middlesworth, Prioritize paperwork over my wife's life was testing every ounce of that discipline. The neighbors, Sarah gasped suddenly. Maybe they can help. She was right. I could see porch lights flickering on across the street. Mrs. Chen, from 2 houses down, was already walking toward the gate, her elderly frame moving as quickly as she could manage. Behind her, I spotted Tom and Jennifer Morrison, the young couple with twin toddlers, jogging down the sidewalk toward the commotion. Maybe reason would prevail. Maybe the sight of concerned neighbors would snap Karen back to reality and remind her that behind all her precious rules were actual human beings with real problems. But as I watched Karen square her shoulders and plant her feet more firmly on the asphalt, I had a sinking feeling that reason was the last thing on her mind tonight. Sarah's breathing became more labored, each exhale a small, frightened sound. I could feel her pulse racing under my fingertips, erratic and weak. The paramedics were probably carrying equipment that could stabilize her, medications that could save her life, expertise that could make the difference between her seeing another sunrise and this being our last evening together. All of it was sitting 200 yards away, blocked by one woman's interpretation of community bylaws. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath, calling on every meditation technique the military had ever taught me. Stay calm, assess the situation, develop a plan, execute with precision. But when I opened my eyes and saw Karen actually wagging her finger at the ambulance driver like he was a child who had broken curfew, something inside me snapped into a different kind of focus entirely. I had spent decades following orders, respecting authority, and working within established systems. I had learned patience, diplomacy, and the art of finding common ground even with unreasonable people. Tonight, I was about to find out if any of that training applied to HOA Karens who stood between my wife and the help she needed to survive. Mrs. Chen reached the gate first, her small frame silhouetted against the ambulance lights. Even through our window, I could see her animated gestures as she spoke to Karen, probably explaining that there was a medical emergency. Mrs. Chen had been a nurse before retiring, and she understood better than most what those flashing lights represented. But Karen didn't even turn to acknowledge her. Instead, she kept her arms crossed, and her attention focused on the ambulance crew, like Mrs. Chen was nothing more than background noise. "Please," I heard Sarah whisper beside me. "It hurts so much." I squeezed her hand, trying to transfer some of my strength to her through that simple touch. "Help is coming, baby. Just hold on." Tom and Jennifer Morrison arrived at the scene, and I watched Tom approach Karen with what I knew would be his usual diplomatic manner. Tom worked in corporate mediation. If anyone could reason with Karen, it would be him. He gestured toward our house, then back to the ambulance, probably explaining the situation that should have been obvious to anyone with functioning brain cells. Karen finally turned to address the growing crowd of neighbors, and even from our living room, I could see her theatrical gestures. She was pointing at her watch, then at the gate, then pulling out what looked like a copy of HOA regulations from her oversized purse. The woman carried community bylaws in her purse, like other people carry tissues. "She's actually quoting rules right now," I muttered in disbelief. More neighbors had emerged from their houses, drawn by the commotion and the inescapable presence of emergency vehicles. I spotted old Mr. Rodriguez from the corner house, the Peterson family with their teenage daughter, and several others I recognized from community barbecues and school events. They formed a loose semicircle around Karen, and I could see their body language growing more agitated by the second. The ambulance driver had gotten out of his vehicle now, a stocky man in his 40s, whose EMT uniform was already damp with sweat, despite the evening coolness. He was speaking rapidly to Karen, and I didn't need to hear the words to understand his desperation. Every paramedic knows that the first few minutes of cardiac emergency can mean the difference between life and death. Behind him, his partner, a young woman who looked barely out of training, was pacing beside the ambulance like a caged animal. She kept glancing toward our house, probably calculating distances and response times, knowing that every second of delay reduced their patient's chances of survival. But Karen wasn't budging. If anything, she seemed to be enjoying the attention. I watched her flip through her papers with the theatrical flair of a prosecutor presenting evidence, occasionally pointing at specific passages and nodding with satisfaction. Mrs. Chen tried to grab Karen's arm, probably to physically turn her attention toward the human crisis at hand. But Karen actually shook her off, stepping back and raising her voice loud enough that I could hear muffled shouting through our windows. "Unbelievable," I breathed. Sarah's grip on my hand suddenly tightened with surprising strength. I can't breathe right," she gasped. I looked down at her face and felt ice water flood my veins. Her lips had taken on a bluish tint, and her skin was no longer just pale. It was approaching gray. Her eyes, usually bright hazel, looked unfocused and distant. "Sarah, stay with me," I said, trying to keep my voice calm while my heart hammered against my ribs. "Look at me, honey. Focus on my voice." She nodded weakly, but I could see the effort it took. This wasn't just chest pain anymore. This was something catastrophic happening inside her body, something that needed immediate medical intervention. I looked back toward the gate and felt rage building in my chest, like a pressure cooker approaching its breaking point. Tom Morrison was now standing directly in front of Karen, his arms spread wide in what appeared to be a pleading gesture. Jennifer had joined Mrs. Chen in trying to reason with her, and I could see both women's faces twisted with frustration and disbelief. The crowd of neighbors had grown to nearly a dozen people, all of them apparently trying to convince one stubborn woman to move her vehicle and let the ambulance through. It should have been simple. It should have taken 30 seconds of explanation and basic human decency. Instead, I watched Karen pull out her phone again. Not to call for help or guidance, but to take more photos. She was documenting the crowd, the ambulance, probably building, some kind of case about neighborhood disruption and unauthorized gatherings. The absurdity of it hit me like a physical blow. My wife was potentially dying in my arms. Paramedics with life-saving equipment and medications were trapped 200 yards away. And this woman was worried about photo evidence for her next HOA board meeting. Mr. Rodriguez, despite his 70-plus years, had apparently had enough. I watched him step forward and point an accusatory finger at Karen, his whole body radiating the kind of indignation that comes from witnessing something fundamentally wrong with the world. Even at his age, he had more fire in him than the younger neighbors who were still trying diplomatic approaches. But Karen simply shook her head at him too, holding up her hand in a stop gesture like she was directing traffic. The young EMT had climbed back into the ambulance and was speaking rapidly into her radio, probably calling for backup or alternative routes. But our development only had one entrance, and Karen's SUV was positioned perfectly to block any vehicle larger than a compact car. Sarah made a small, frightened sound that cut through my observations and brought my attention crashing back to the immediate crisis. Her breathing was becoming more shallow, more labored, and when I pressed my fingers to her wrist, her pulse felt weak and irregular. "Hold on, baby," I whispered, kissing her forehead again. "Just hold on." But inside, I was calculating time and distances and probabilities, using the same tactical assessment skills that had kept me alive through multiple deployments. Sarah needed help now, not in 5 minutes or 10 minutes. Every second of delay was moving her closer to a point of no return. I could see the male EMT getting out of the ambulance again, this time carrying what looked like a medical bag. He was probably planning to run the 200 yards to our house, on foot, carrying whatever emergency equipment he could manage. It wasn't ideal, but it was better than sitting trapped behind Karen's self-righteous roadblock. But as he stepped around the ambulance, Karen actually moved to block his path too, holding up both hands and shaking her head vigorously. She wasn't just blocking the vehicle. She was blocking the paramedics themselves. That's when I heard Jennifer Morrison's voice rise above the general commotion, loud enough to carry through our windows. "Are you insane? There's a woman dying in there." Karen's response was equally audible, delivered with the kind of righteous indignation that only truly delusional people can muster. Rules exist for everyone's safety. If we start making exceptions, where does it end? I stared at the scene in complete disbelief. A trained medical professional was literally being prevented from reaching a cardiac emergency patient by a woman who measured grass heights for fun. Sarah's hand in mine was growing cold, and her breathing had developed an ominous rattle that I recognized from too many battlefield medical situations. Time was running out, and the cavalry was stuck at the gate. It was time to stop being a spectator in my own wife's medical crisis. I gently disentangled my hand from Sarah's, careful not to disturb her any more than necessary. "I'll be right back, sweetheart. I'm going to fix this." She nodded weakly, her eyes already starting to flutter closed. The sight sent another spike of urgency through my system, but I forced myself to move calmly and deliberately. Panic would help no one. I walked to our front closet and opened the door, my hand moving automatically to the garment bag hanging in the back corner. Inside was a uniform I hadn't worn in 6 months, not since my retirement ceremony. The fabric was perfectly pressed, the insignia polished to a mirror shine, every detail maintained to the exacting standards that had been drilled into me over more than 2 decades of service. But I didn't put it on. Not yet. Instead, I grabbed a plain jacket from the front of the closet and headed for the door. Sometimes the most powerful revelations came not from what people expected, but from what they never saw coming. The evening air hit my face as I stepped outside, carrying the sounds of heated argument and frustrated pleading. I could hear Karen's voice more clearly now, still lecturing the growing crowd about proper procedures and community standards. "The HOA board voted on these security measures for a reason," she was saying, her tone suggesting she was addressing a group of particularly slow children. "We can't just abandon our protocols every time someone claims there's an emergency." Claims there's an emergency. The words hit me like a physical slap. I walked down our front path with measured steps, my military bearing automatic after so many years. Shoulders back, head high, eyes forward. The crowd at the gate hadn't noticed me yet. They were all focused on Karen's performance and their own desperate attempts to make her see reason. The ambulance lights continued their frantic dance, and I could see both EMTs growing more agitated by the second. The male paramedic was now holding his medical bag like he was ready to make a run for it regardless of Karen's objections, while his partner was speaking rapidly into her radio again. Mrs. Chen saw me first. Her eyes widened slightly, and she nudged Jennifer Morrison, who turned to look in my direction. One by one, the neighbors became aware of my approach, their arguments with Karen momentarily pausing as they registered my presence. I hadn't said a word yet, but something about my demeanor, the way I carried myself, the deliberate calm of my movements, seemed to cut through the chaos like a knife through noise. Karen, however, was too busy with her righteous lecture to notice the change in her audience's attention. She was waving her HOA documentation in the air, pointing at specific clauses with the fervor of an evangelical preacher quoting scripture. Section 4.7 clearly states that all emergency vehicle access must be pre-approved by the HOA board or our contracted security service, she continued, oblivious to the fact that half her audience was no longer looking at her. We have procedures for a reason, people. I stopped about 10 feet from the crowd, close enough to be part of the scene, but far enough away to maintain an observer's perspective. Still, I said nothing. Sometimes silence carried more weight than shouting. Tom Morrison was the first to break away from the group and approach me. "Thank God you're here," he said quietly. "We've been trying to reason with her for 10 minutes, but she won't budge. How's Sarah?" "Not good," I replied, my voice level and controlled. "She needs help now. Tom nodded and turned back toward Karen, who had finally noticed that her audience's attention was divided. She followed their gazes and spotted me standing at the edge of the group, taking in my civilian clothes and unremarkable appearance. Her expression shifted from annoyed to smug. Here, clearly, was the man of the house, someone she could address directly instead of dealing with concerned neighbors who didn't understand proper procedures. "You must be Sarah's husband," she said, walking toward me with the confident stride of someone who believed she held all the cards. "I'm Karen Middlesworth, HOA board member. I understand your wife is having some kind of medical issue, but we have protocols that must be followed." She stopped directly in front of me, close enough that I could see the perfectly applied makeup and the small pin on her shirt collar that read HOA board member in gold letters. Everything about her radiated self-importance and unwavering certainty in her own authority. "These paramedics arrived without proper authorization," she continued, gesturing toward the ambulance crew with dismissive authority. "Our community has security measures in place, and I can't simply allow unauthorized vehicles to bypass our systems. I'm sure you understand the importance of maintaining order." I looked at her for a long moment, studying her face with the same calm assessment I had once used to evaluate potential threats in hostile territory. She met my gaze with complete confidence, probably interpreting my silence as agreement or submission to her authority. Behind her, I could see the neighbors watching our interaction with barely contained frustration. Mrs. Chen was shaking her head in disgust. The Morrisons looked like they wanted to physically intervene. Even gentle Mr. Rodriguez was clenching his fists at his sides. The ambulance crew had stopped their radio communications and were now watching too, probably hoping that the homeowner's arrival would finally break the deadlock that was keeping them from their patient. Karen smiled. Actually smiled, as she prepared to deliver what she clearly thought would be the closing argument in her favor. "I'm sure once you understand the situation, you'll agree that we need to follow proper channels," she said, her tone taking on a condescending sweetness. "Perhaps if you call the HOA emergency line and explain the situation, we can get authorization within the next hour or two. An hour or two. To get authorization for paramedics to treat a cardiac emergency." I felt something shift inside me, like the final tumbler falling into place on a lock that had been waiting to open for years. All the bureaucratic nonsense I had dealt with in the military, all the petty officials who prioritized paperwork over people, all the small-minded authority figures who wielded their tiny kingdoms like weapons, it all crystallized in this moment, in this woman, in this absolutely unconscionable situation. But I still didn't speak. Instead, I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out my wallet, moving with the same deliberate calm that had characterized my entire approach. Karen's smile widened slightly, probably thinking I was reaching for identification or HOA documentation. That would help expedite her precious procedures. The neighbors leaned forward slightly, sensing that something significant was about to happen, but not sure what. The EMTs stopped their pacing and focused their attention on our conversation, hope flickering in their eyes that this might finally be the breakthrough they desperately needed. And my wife, 200 yards away, continued to fight for every breath, while her heart struggled against whatever was trying to kill her. I opened my wallet slowly, my fingers finding the item I was looking for without needing to look. After 23 years, I could locate it by touch alone. Karen was still talking, something about community standards and the importance of supporting HOA initiatives, but her words had become background noise. All of my attention was focused on the simple act of pulling out a single piece of identification and holding it where she could see it. The neighbors fell silent first, those close enough to see what I was holding. Then the silence spread outward like ripples on a pond, until even Karen's lecture trailed off into confused quiet. She looked down at what I was showing her, and I watched her face change from smug confidence to puzzled uncertainty to something approaching recognition. But I still wasn't done with my revelation. This was just the opening act. Karen stared at my military ID for several seconds, her brain apparently struggling to process what she was seeing. The plastic card caught the ambulance lights, reflecting red and blue across my photograph, and the official seals that marked it as genuine federal identification. "You're military," she said, her voice suddenly less certain than it had been moments before. "Was," I replied simply, returning the ID to my wallet. 23 years. Retired 6 months ago." I could see the wheels turning in her head, probably trying to calculate how this new information affected her position. But before she could formulate a response, a sharp cry from the ambulance cut through the night air. "We need to move now." The female EMT was leaning out of the passenger side, dour, her radio crackling with urgent communications. "Dispatch says we have a cardiac event in progress. Every second counts." The male paramedic stepped forward, his medical bag clutched tightly in both hands. "Ma'am, please. I've been an EMT for 15 years. I know what a heart attack looks like, and we are running out of time." But Karen, instead of being moved by the urgency in his voice, seemed to dig in her heels even deeper. "I don't care if you're the Surgeon General," she snapped, her attention swinging between me and the paramedic. "Rules are rules. This is a private community with security protocols, and I'm not going to be the board member who compromises our safety standards." Mrs. Chen made a sound of pure disgust. "Safety standards? There's a woman dying." "So she claims," Karen shot back, and I felt something cold and dangerous settle in my chest at those words. "Anyone can call 911 and claim an emergency. That's exactly why we have verification procedures." Tom Morrison stepped forward, his diplomatic facade finally cracking. "Karen, I've lived next door to them for 8 years. I saw Sarah collapse on their front porch an hour ago. This isn't some elaborate hoax to bypass your precious gate rules." But Karen was beyond reason now. She had committed to her position, and backing down would mean admitting she was wrong. Something I suspected she had never done in her entire adult life. "The protocols exist for everyone's protection," she repeated, her voice rising to match the growing frustration around her. "If we start making exceptions every time someone has a medical issue, where does it end? Pretty soon, every pizza delivery and repair truck will claim they're responding to an emergency." I looked at her face, seeing the absolute certainty there, the complete inability to distinguish between pizza delivery and paramedics treating a cardiac arrest. This wasn't just bureaucratic rigidity. This was something fundamentally broken in how she processed basic human reality. Behind me, I heard a sound that made my blood turn to ice water. Sarah calling my name from inside the house, her voice weak and desperate and afraid. The sound cut through the night like a gunshot, and even Karen's self-righteous expression faltered slightly. There was no mistaking the sound of someone in mortal distress, no bureaucratic interpretation that could explain away that level of human fear and pain. The male EMT heard it too, and he took another step toward Karen, his professional composure finally beginning to crack. "Please," he said, and there was genuine pleading in his voice now. "I have a wife at home. I have kids. That could be my family in there. Just move your car." Karen actually took a step backward, but she shook her head again. "I'm not moving anything until I see proper authorization. That's final." The younger EMT had gotten out of the ambulance now and was speaking rapidly into her portable radio. I caught fragments of her conversation. "Blocked access. Patient in distress. Needs supervisor authorization for alternate approach." Alternate approach. They were trying to figure out how to get around Karen's obstruction, probably calling for a smaller emergency vehicle or a helicopter or some other resource that would take precious minutes to arrive. Minutes that Sarah didn't have. I closed my eyes for a moment and calculated the distance from the gate to our front door. 200 yards. A healthy person could run it in maybe 30 seconds. But carrying medical equipment, possibly including a stretcher and cardiac support devices over suburban sidewalks and lawn, 3 minutes minimum, maybe 5, and that was assuming they could even get past Karen, who seemed determined to block not just vehicles, but the paramedics themselves. "How long?" I asked the male EMT, my voice cutting through Karen's continued protestations about proper procedures. He understood immediately what I was asking. "Cardiac arrest patients have maybe 8 to 10 minutes before brain damage starts," he said, his words hitting the crowd like physical blows. "After that," he shrugged helplessly. I looked at my watch. Sarah's symptoms had started over an hour ago, but the acute phase, the collapse, the obvious distress, had been maybe 15 minutes. If this was a full cardiac arrest, we were already deep into the danger zone. Mrs. Chen must have done the same math because she suddenly grabbed Karen's arm with surprising strength for her age. "You're killing her," she said, her voice shaking, with rage and disbelief. "Do you understand that? You are literally killing this woman." Karen jerked her arm free. "I'm protecting this community. We have rules for a reason, and I'm not going to—" "Shut up!" The roar came from Mr. Rodriguez, the mild-mannered 70-year-old retiree who coached Little League and helped neighbors with their gardening. His face was red with fury, and he was pointing at Karen with the kind of righteous anger that comes from witnessing something fundamentally evil. "You heartless witch! There's a woman dying 200 yards away, and you're worried about your stupid paperwork." The crowd of neighbors murmured agreement, their frustration finally boiling over into open hostility. Jennifer Morrison was crying, now probably thinking about her own family and how she would feel if someone blocked help from reaching her children. Tom had his phone out, frantically dialing numbers, probably trying to reach other HOA board members or community management. But Karen seemed to feed on the opposition, like their anger was validating her position rather than highlighting its absurdity. "I'm the only one here who cares about the long-term safety and security of this community," she declared, her voice taking on a martyred tone. "Someone has to be the adult in the room." That's when I heard Sarah call my name again. Weaker this time, more frightened. The sound cut through my composure like a blade, and I felt 23 years of military discipline warring against a husband's desperation. The female EMT had finished her radio conversation, and was approaching the group with grim determination. Supervisor says we can try to go around through the emergency access road, but it'll add at least 10 minutes to our response time. She looked directly at me. Sir, I have to ask, is 10 minutes something your wife can afford? I looked at E, her young face, seeing the professional frustration and human compassion warring in her eyes. She was asking me to make a decision no husband should ever have to make. Risk waiting for bureaucracy to sort itself out, or watch time run out while help sat 200 yards away. But before I could answer, Karen inserted herself back into the conversation with the timing of someone who had never learned to read a room. See? There are proper procedures for these situations, she said, apparently interpreting the EMT's words as vindication of her position. All we needed to do was follow the right channels from the beginning. 10 more minutes. Added to the time we'd already lost, it might as well have been 10 hours. I looked at Karen's satisfied expression, at the neighbors' horrified faces, at the EMT's professional frustration, and made a decision that I knew would change everything. Was time to stop being polite. It was time to stop respecting her authority. It was time to show Karen Middlesworth exactly who she was dealing with. I walked back toward my house with the same measured pace I had used to approach the gate, leaving. The crowd in stunned silence behind me. I could feel their eyes following my movement, probably wondering if I was giving up, retreating in the face of Karen's bureaucratic stonewalling. They had no idea what was coming. Sarah was exactly where I had left her on the couch, but her condition had visibly deteriorated in the few minutes I'd been outside. Her breathing was more labored. Her skin had taken on a grayish pallor that I recognized from too many combat medical situations, and her eyes had that unfocused quality that meant her brain wasn't getting enough oxygen. "I'm here, baby," I whispered, kissing her forehead. "Help is coming. I promise you, help is coming." She managed a weak nod, but I could see the effort it took. Every breath was a struggle now, every heartbeat a victory against whatever was trying to kill her. I went to our bedroom and opened the closet, my hands moving with practiced efficiency to the garment bag I had ignored earlier. Inside was my dress uniform, the one I had worn to retirement ceremonies and formal dinners, and occasions when the full weight of military authority needed to be displayed. But tonight wasn't about ceremony or formality. Tonight was about making a point that needed to be made with crystal clarity. I pulled out my service dress blue uniform, the dark navy fabric immaculate, the ribbons and insignia arranged in perfect regulation order. 23 years of service were represented on that chest. Combat deployments, commendations for valor, leadership awards, specialty qualifications, and the kind of recognition that came from dedicating your life to something bigger than yourself. But it wasn't the ribbons that would matter tonight. It wasn't the rank insignia, or the precision of the tailoring, or the symbolic weight of the uniform itself. It was what the uniform represented. Legitimate authority, earned through sacrifice and service, recognized by federal law, and backed by the full power of the United States government. I changed quickly, muscle memory guiding my hands through the familiar routine of putting on a uniform I had worn thousands of times over more than 2 decades. The fit was perfect. I had maintained my military bearing and physical condition through 6 months of retirement, partly out of habit, and partly because I had never been able to fully let go of who I had been for most of my adult life. When I looked in the mirror. I saw the person I had been for 23 years, a federal officer with legitimate authority, earned rank, and the legal power to take command of situations that threatened public safety. Karen Middlesworth was about to learn the difference between real authority and the petty power of a homeowners association board member. I walked back to Sarah and knelt beside the couch, taking her hand again. Her pulse was weaker now, more irregular, and I could see the fear in her eyes as she struggled to stay conscious. "I'm going to fix this right now," I told her, my voice carrying the absolute certainty that had once reassured soldiers under fire. "You hold on, and I'll handle everything else." She squeezed my hand with what little strength she had left, and I kissed her forehead one more time before standing and walking back toward the front door. The scene at the gate had grown more chaotic in my absence. More neighbors had emerged from their houses, drawn by the commotion and the persistent flash of emergency lights. I could see people from 3 streets over, all of them clustering around the ambulance and Karen's SUV, all of them, apparently, trying to add their voices to the chorus of reason that was falling on completely deaf ears. Karen was still holding court in the center of it all, her HOA documentation clutched in one hand and her phone in the other, probably documenting everything for what she no doubt saw as a vindication of her position. She was talking animatedly to someone on the phone, probably another board member or the community management company, getting backup for her interpretation of the rules. The EMTs had given up trying to reason with her directly, and were now focused on their radios, coordinating with dispatch and supervisors and trying to arrange alternative approaches that wouldn't require dealing with Karen's roadblock. But as I stepped out of my house and started walking toward the gate, the dynamic began to change. Mrs. Chen saw me first, and her expression shifted from frustrated anger to something approaching awe. Then Jennifer Morrison noticed, followed by Tom, then Mr. Rodriguez, then the growing crowd of neighbors who had never seen me in anything more formal than weekend casual wear. The conversations began to die down as people registered what they were seeing. Not just a neighbor in a military uniform, but someone whose bearing and insignia suggested serious rank and significant authority. The EMTs noticed the change in the crowd's attention and looked in my direction. The male paramedic's eyes widened as he took in my uniform and rank, while his partner actually straightened to attention, a reflexive response that suggested prior military service. But Karen was still focused on her phone conversation, still oblivious to the shift happening around her. She was pacing in small circles, gesturing with her free hand as she explained her position to whoever was on the other end of the line. I reached the edge of the crowd and stopped, letting my presence speak before I said a word. The neighbors parted automatically, creating a clear path between me and Karen, their expressions ranging from curiosity to anticipation to something that looked like relief. Finally, Karen ended her phone call and looked up to see why her audience had gone quiet. Her eyes found me standing at the edge of the crowd, and I watched her face cycle through confusion, recognition, and finally something that might have been the first hint of uncertainty she had shown all evening. "You?" she started, then stopped, her gaze moving from my face to my uniform to the rank insignia on my collar. "Colonel," I said simply, my voice carrying the quiet authority that comes from 23 years of command experience. United States Air Force, retired. The word colonel hit the crowd like an electric shock. Neighbors who had known me for years as just another suburban homeowner were seeing me for the first time as I had been for most of my adult life. A senior, military officer with federal authority and the kind of legitimate power that made HOA board positions look like children playing dress-up. Karen's mouth opened and closed without sound, her brain apparently struggling to process this new information and figure out how it affected her position of authority. The male EMT stepped forward and actually came to attention. "Sir," he said, his voice carrying the respect that military rank commanded even in civilian situations. "We have a cardiac emergency patient who needs immediate medical attention, but we're being prevented from accessing the scene." I nodded. Acknowledgement to the paramedic, then turned my full attention to Karen. She was still standing in front of her SUV, still blocking the ambulance's path, but something had changed in her posture. The smug confidence was gone, replaced by uncertainty, and what looked like the first stirrings of real fear. "Mrs. Middlesworth," I said, my voice calm and level, and carrying the unmistakable tone of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "You have 30 seconds to move your vehicle and allow these medical professionals to do their job." She stared at me for a long moment, her HOA documentation hanging forgotten in her hands. Around us, the neighbors watched in absolute silence, probably holding their breath to see how this confrontation would resolve. But Karen, even faced with legitimate federal authority and the moral weight of a medical emergency, couldn't quite bring herself to admit she was wrong. I have authority here," she stammered, her voice much less certain than it had been minutes earlier. "This is HOA property, and I'm a board member with the responsibility to—" "No," I said, cutting her off with the kind of quiet finality that ended discussions rather than extending them. "You have no authority here. None whatsoever." I took a step closer, and she instinctively stepped back, bumping against her SUV. "What you have," I continued, "is a choice. Move your vehicle now, or I will move it for you." Karen pressed herself back against her SUV, her eyes darting between my uniform and the crowd of neighbors who were now watching our confrontation with rapt attention. I could see her mind racing, probably trying to calculate whether her perceived HOA authority could somehow trump 23 years of federal military service. You can't just," she started, but her voice had lost all of its earlier certainty. "I can," I replied, my tone carrying the quiet certainty of someone who had spent decades making decisions in life-and-death situations. "And I will." I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out my phone, holding it where she could see it. "I can call the base commander at the nearest Air Force installation and have military police here in 15 minutes. I can call the county sheriff and explain that a civilian is interfering with federal emergency response procedures. Or I can call the state police and report an active obstruction of emergency medical services." Karen's eyes widened as each option registered. Whatever fantasy she had been living about her authority and importance was crashing against the reality of how actual power worked in the real world. "But," I continued, putting my phone away, "all of those options take time that my wife doesn't have. So, I'm going to give you one more chance to do the right thing voluntarily." The male EMT stepped closer, clearly recognizing the shift in dynamics. "Sir, if I may, we estimate the patient has maybe 3 to 4 minutes before irreversible damage begins. 3 to 4 minutes. I felt the number hit me like a physical blow, but I kept my expression calm and controlled. In combat situations, panic was contagious and deadly. Leaders stayed calm, so everyone else could do their jobs. "Thank you, Sergeant," I said, noticing the subtle military bearing in the paramedic's posture and making an educated guess about his background. "Actually, Corpsman, sir. Navy Medical Corps before I became a civilian EMT." I nodded acknowledgement. Military medical personnel were some of the best in the world. If he said 3 to 4 minutes, I believed him completely. I turned back to Karen, who was still pressed against her SUV like she was trying to merge with the metal. "Mrs. Middlesworth, you now have direct information from a medical professional that your actions are putting someone's life in immediate danger. You have approximately 3 minutes to make a decision that you'll have to live with for the rest of your life." Around us, the crowd had grown completely silent. Even the normal background sounds of the suburban evening seemed muted, like the entire neighborhood was holding its breath, waiting to see how this would resolve. Karen's gaze darted around the circle of faces surrounding her, probably looking for support or sympathy, or some sign that her position wasn't completely insane. But every face she saw reflected some combination of disgust, disbelief, and growing anger. Mrs. Chen, who had been a nurse for 40 years before retiring, looked at Karen with the kind of professional contempt reserved for people who put bureaucracy above human life. Tom and Jennifer Morrison stood with their arms around each other, probably thinking about their own family and how they would feel if someone blocked help from reaching their children. Even the teenagers who had wandered over from neighboring houses were staring at Karen with expressions of pure disbelief, their young faces showing the kind of moral clarity that hadn't yet been corrupted by years of bureaucratic thinking. Karen started, then stopped, her voice barely above a whisper. But then something happened that I should have anticipated, but somehow didn't. Faced with overwhelming opposition and the collapse of her perceived authority, Karen doubled down. "No," she said, her voice suddenly stronger again. "No, I won't be bullied by military intimidation tactics. This is a civilian community with civilian governance, and your uniform doesn't give you the right to override our legally established procedures." The crowd actually gasped at her words. Several neighbors shook their heads in disbelief, and I heard Tom Morrison mutter, "Jesus Christ, what is wrong with her?" But I wasn't surprised. I had dealt with enough petty bureaucrats over the years to recognize the type. People who confused having a little bit of power with being important, who would rather watch the world burn than admit they were wrong about anything. "Legally established. Procedures," I repeated, my voice still calm, but now carrying an edge that made several neighbors take an involuntary step backward. "You want to talk about legal authority?" I pulled out my military retiree ID card, the one that carried federal recognition and legal weight. "This card gives me authority under federal law to take command of emergency situations that threaten public safety. That authority supersedes any local or community regulations, including your HOA bylaws." Karen stared at the ID, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. "Furthermore," I continued, "your willful obstruction of emergency medical services constitutes criminal negligence under state law, and your continued interference with federal emergency response protocols could result in federal charges." I was stretching the legal truth somewhat. My retiree status didn't give me quite the authority I was claiming, but Karen didn't know that, and the situation was desperate enough to warrant some creative interpretation of regulations. "Now," I said, putting the ID away and checking my watch with deliberate precision, "you have approximately 90 seconds to move your vehicle before I consider you a clear and present danger to public safety, and take appropriate action." The former Navy corpsman was nodding approval at my approach, while his partner was already moving toward the ambulance, clearly preparing for immediate departure once the obstruction was cleared. But Karen, in a display of stubbornness that bordered on mental illness, crossed her arms and shook her head. "I'm not moving," she said, her voice shaking but determined. "You can threaten me all you want, but this is my community, and I have a responsibility to—" "Time's up," I said, cutting her off mid-sentence. I walked around to the driver's side of her SUV and tested the door handle. Locked, of course, but that wasn't going to be a problem. Karen's eyes widened as she realized what I was planning. "You can't! That's my property. You can't just—" "Ma'am," I said, looking directly at her with the kind of steady gaze that had once convinced Taliban fighters to surrender rather than face the consequences of continued resistance. I strongly suggest you step away from this vehicle." She looked at my face, at my uniform, at the crowd of neighbors who were now watching with expressions of anticipation rather than concern, and something finally seemed to click in her brain. For the first time all evening, Karen Middlesworth appeared to understand that she was not, in fact, the ultimate authority in this situation. She stepped away from her SUV. I didn't waste time with explanations or procedures. The moment Karen stepped away from her vehicle, I motioned to Tom Morrison, who had been standing close enough to hear everything. "Tom, do you still have your old pickup truck?" He nodded immediately. "Yeah, it's in my driveway." "Get it. Now, we're going to push her SUV out of the way." Tom was already jogging toward his house before I finished the sentence. Behind me, I could hear the ambulance crew starting their engine, preparing for immediate movement the second the path was clear. Karen stood frozen beside her displaced SUV, apparently still processing the fact that her authority had been not just challenged, but completely overruled. She watched Tom sprint up his driveway with the expression of someone witnessing the collapse of everything she thought she understood about how the world worked. "You can't just move my car," she said, weakly, but there was no fight left in her voice. "Watch me," I replied, already positioning myself at the rear of her SUV to guide it once Tom's truck made contact. The neighbors had formed a loose circle around the scene, some of them pulling out phones to record what was clearly going to be a memorable moment in community history. Mrs. Chen was actually smiling for the first time all evening, while Mr. Rodriguez was nodding approval and muttering what sounded like prayers in Spanish. Tom's pickup truck came roaring down his driveway, in reverse, and he positioned it behind Karen's SUV with the precision of someone who had been moving obstacles out of the way for most of his adult life. The man worked in corporate problem-solving, and tonight he had found a problem that could be solved, with horsepower and determination. "On three!" I called out, positioning myself where I could guide the SUV's movement. "1, 2, 3! Tom's truck made contact with Karen's rear bumper with a satisfying thunk, and her SUV began moving sideways, across the pavement. It wasn't elegant, and it definitely wasn't gentle, but it was effective. Within 30 seconds, we had pushed her vehicle completely clear of the ambulance's path. The moment the way was clear, the ambulance lurched forward with the urgency of professionals who had been forced to waste precious minutes on bureaucratic nonsense. The siren wailed back to life, and the vehicle covered the 200 yards to our house in what felt like seconds. I was already running alongside the ambulance, my military fitness serving me well as I kept pace with the vehicle toward our front door. Behind me, I could hear several neighbors following, probably wanting to help or at least witness the resolution of the crisis they had all been part of. The ambulance stopped directly in front of our house, and both EMTs were out, and moving before the engine had fully shut down. The male corpsman grabbed a medical bag and what looked like cardiac monitoring equipment, while his partner wheeled a portable stretcher from the back of the vehicle. "Through the front door, directly ahead," I called out, leading them up our walkway. "She's on the living room couch." We burst through the front door like a military assault team, all urgency and purpose and desperate hope that we weren't too late. Sarah was exactly where I had left her, but her condition had deteriorated significantly in the time I'd been dealing with Karen's obstruction. Her breathing was shallow and irregular. Her skin had taken on a grayish pallor that made her look almost translucent, and her eyes were closed. "Sarah," I said, kneeling beside the couch and taking her hand. "The paramedics are here, honey. Help is here." Her eyes fluttered open at the sound of my voice, and she managed a weak smile that broke my heart and filled it with hope at the same time. The corpsman was already beside her, his hands moving with practiced efficiency as he checked her pulse, blood pressure, and breathing. His partner was setting up monitoring equipment and preparing what looked like cardiac medications. "How long has she been symptomatic?" he asked, his attention focused on his patient, but his question directed at me. "Chest pains started about 90 minutes ago," I replied, maintaining my grip on Sarah's hand. "Severe symptoms for the last 20 minutes or so," he nodded, connecting monitoring leads to Sarah's chest and arms. The portable EKG machine began displaying her heart rhythm immediately, and I didn't need medical training to see that something was seriously wrong with the pattern on the screen. "Definite cardiac event," he told his partner. "Probably a STEMI. We need to move fast." STEMI, ST elevation, myocardial infarction, a major heart attack that required immediate intervention to prevent permanent damage or death. The female EMT was already preparing medications, drawing doses from small vials with the kind of speed that comes from thousands of hours of emergency training. "Transport to cardiac center?" she asked. "Absolutely. Call ahead and tell them we're coming in. Hot with a STEMI patient." ETA? He glanced at his watch and seemed to be calculating distances and traffic patterns. 12 minutes, if we move now. 12 minutes. After all the delays, all the bureaucratic nonsense, all the time wasted arguing with Karen about procedures and protocols, Sarah's survival was going to come down to a 12-minute race against time. They had her connected to portable monitors and IV lines within 3 minutes, moving with the kind of coordinated efficiency that made my military heart proud. These were consummate professionals doing exactly what they had trained their entire careers to do, and they were doing it perfectly. "Sir," the corpsman said, looking directly at me, "we need to transport immediately. You can ride with us, but you'll need to stay out of our way and follow our instructions exactly." "Understood," I replied, already helping them lift Sarah onto the stretcher. She was conscious, but weak, her hand still gripping mine with what little strength she had left. As we wheeled her toward the ambulance, I could see the crowd of neighbors gathered on our front lawn. Mrs. Chen was crying. Tom and Jennifer Morrison were holding each other, and even the teenagers were standing in respectful silence as we passed. But my attention was focused on the figure standing beside her damaged SUV at the community gate. Karen Middlesworth was still there, watching our procession with an expression I couldn't quite read. It might have been shock, or shame, or simple disbelief at how quickly her authority had crumbled when faced with real-world consequences. I looked directly at her as we loaded Sarah into the ambulance, and for just a moment our eyes met across the distance. In that look, I tried to convey everything I was feeling: the terror of nearly losing my wife, the rage at having precious minutes stolen by bureaucratic stubbornness, and the cold satisfaction of watching someone learn the difference between petty power and legitimate authority. But mostly, I tried to convey a simple message. This was what real consequences looked like when you prioritized rules over human life. The ambulance doors slammed shut, the siren wailed back to life, and we roared away from the community gate toward the cardiac center 12 minutes away. In the back of the ambulance, surrounded by medical equipment and the controlled chaos of emergency treatment, I held my wife's hand and watched the monitors that would tell us whether Karen's obstruction had cost us everything that mattered. The cardiac catheterization lab at Regional Medical Center was a temple of controlled urgency, all stainless steel, and advanced technology and professionals who moved with the precision of a Swiss watch. I watched through the observation window as the interventional cardiologist worked to clear the blockage in Sarah's coronary artery, knowing that every second of delay from earlier that evening had made this procedure more dangerous and more necessary. The doctor had been blunt in his assessment. Another 10 minutes, and we would have been looking at massive permanent damage, maybe fatal damage. You got her here just in time. Just in time. The words echoed in my head as I watched my wife's life hanging in the balance, supported by machines and medications and the skill of people who had dedicated their careers to saving lives. The procedure took 2 hours, but the cardiologist emerged with news that made my knees weak with relief. They had successfully opened the blocked artery. The damage to Sarah's heart muscle was minimal, and her prognosis was excellent. "She's going to be fine," he said, his voice carrying the quiet satisfaction of someone who had just won a battle against death. "Full recovery expected. She'll be in ICU overnight for monitoring, but she should be going home in 2 or 3 days." I sat in the ICU waiting room for the next 6 hours, watching the sun rise through institutional windows, while Sarah slept under careful medical supervision. The monitors showed steady heart rhythms, stable blood pressure, and all the other numbers that meant she was going to survive what should have killed her. At 8 in the morning, Tom Morrison appeared in the waiting room carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing the expression of someone who had spent the night worrying about his neighbors. "How is she?" he asked, settling into the chair beside me. "She's going to be fine," I said, accepting the coffee gratefully. "Full recovery. The doctor said we got her there just in time." Tom nodded, then was quiet for a long moment. Finally, he said, "I need to tell you what happened after you left." I looked at him, seeing something in his expression that suggested the story wasn't over. "Karen," he said simply. "What about her?" She tried to file complaints, called the HOA management company, called the sheriff's department, called anyone who would listen. She claimed you threatened her, that you damaged her property, that you exceeded your authority. I felt a familiar coldness settle in my chest. Even after everything that had happened, even after nearly causing someone's death through bureaucratic stubbornness, Karen was still trying to make herself the victim in the situation. "And?" I asked. Tom smiled grimly. "Well, the sheriff's deputy who responded was a Marine veteran. When he found out you were Air Force and what had actually happened, he spent about 20 minutes explaining to Karen exactly how many laws she had broken by obstructing emergency medical services." 20 minutes? Apparently, she kept interrupting him to explain about HOA authority and proper procedures. He finally told her that if she said one more word about procedures, he was going to arrest her for interfering with a federal investigation. I felt a grim satisfaction at that image. Military veterans tended to understand the difference between legitimate authority and petty officialdom. "But that's not the best part," Tom continued. 3 other HOA board members showed up around midnight. Seems like word had gotten around the community about what happened, and they were not happy about being associated with someone who had blocked an ambulance. They voted her off the board? Unanimously? Emergency session? They also passed a resolution specifically prohibiting any HOA member from interfering with emergency services under any circumstances. They're calling it the Sarah's Law Resolution. I sat back in my chair, processing the information. In one evening, Karen's absolute certainty about her authority had not only been challenged and overruled, but had resulted in her complete removal from the position she had used to justify her actions. "How did she take it?" I asked. Tom's expression grew more serious. "That's the thing that bothers me. She just stood there. Didn't argue, didn't protest, didn't try to defend herself. Just listened to them remove her from the board and then walked back to her house without saying a word." I thought about that for a moment. In my experience, people like Karen didn't usually accept defeat gracefully. They fought back, made accusations, tried to find someone else to blame for their mistakes. Mrs. Chen thinks she's in shock, Tom continued. Says she's seen it before in people who have their whole world view collapse at once. Like she can't process the fact that her authority wasn't real. Maybe that's for the best, I said. Maybe she needed to learn that lesson. Maybe. But I keep thinking about the look on her face when they drove you away in the ambulance, like she finally understood what she had almost done. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, two neighbors who had shared something that neither of us would ever forget. Finally, Tom stood up and prepared to leave. The whole community knows what happened, he said. And I mean everyone. Word travels fast when someone nearly dies because of bureaucratic stupidity. And they're calling you a hero. The guy who stood up to HOA tyranny and saved his wife's life through sheer force of will and military authority. I shook my head. I'm not a hero. I'm just a husband who wasn't going to let some petty official kill his wife through bureaucratic stubbornness. Maybe that's what heroes are, Tom said. People who do the right thing when it matters most. After he left, I went back to Sarah's ICU room and sat beside her bed, watching her sleep peacefully under the careful monitoring of machines that showed steady improvement in all her vital signs. The crisis was over, the danger had passed, and she was going to make a full recovery. But I couldn't stop thinking about Karen Middlesworth and the look Tom had described, the moment when someone's entire sense of self collapsed under the weight of real-world consequences. I had spent 23 years serving my country, following orders, respecting authority, and working within established systems. I believed in rules and procedures and the importance of maintaining order, but I also believed that all of those things existed to serve people, not the other way around. Rules that prevented saving lives weren't rules worth following. Authority that prioritized bureaucracy over human welfare wasn't authority worth respecting. Karen had confused having power with being important, had mistaken following procedures for doing the right thing. In her mind, she had been protecting her community by enforcing its standards. In reality, she had nearly killed my wife. 3 days later, Sarah came home to a neighborhood that looked exactly the same, but felt completely different. The same houses, the same streets, the same community gate that had been the site of our confrontation. But Karen's house, the perfectly maintained colonial with the precisely measured lawn and the regulation mailbox, sat empty and dark. A for sale sign had appeared in the front yard, and Tom told me she had moved out without talking to any of the neighbors. Couldn't face the shame, I think, he said. Everyone knows what happened. Every time she went to the grocery store or the gas station, people would recognize her as the woman who blocked the ambulance. I felt a complicated mix of emotions about her departure. Satisfaction that justice had been served, but also something that might have been pity for someone whose entire sense of self had been built on such a fragile foundation. 6 months later, Sarah and I were sitting on our front porch, watching the sunset paint our community in shades of gold and orange. She had made a complete recovery, had returned to work, had resumed all the activities that made her who she was. But we both carried the memory of that night, the terror, the urgency, the moment when bureaucratic stubbornness had nearly cost us everything that mattered. "Do you ever think about her?" Sarah asked, following my gaze toward the house that was still for sale 6 months later. "Sometimes," I admitted. "I wonder if she learned anything from what happened." "I think she did," Sarah said quietly. "I think she learned that rules without compassion aren't rules at all. They're just excuses for people who are afraid to make real decisions when it matters." I nodded, thinking about all the petty officials and small-minded bureaucrats I had encountered over the years, people who hid behind regulations and procedures. because making actual judgments required courage and wisdom they didn't possess. Karen Middlesworth had been the ultimate expression of that mindset. Someone so invested in her interpretation of rules that she had lost sight of why those rules existed in the first place. That night, she had finally been forced to confront the difference between having authority and deserving it, between following procedures and doing the right thing, between being important and actually mattering. The lesson had cost her everything she thought. She valued her position, her reputation, her place in the community she had claimed to protect. But it had taught the rest of us something equally valuable: that real authority comes not from titles or positions or perfectly interpreted regulations, but from the willingness to do what's right when everything is on the line. And sometimes, when bureaucracy threatens life itself, the most important rule is knowing when to break all the other rules. In the end, Karen Middlesworth's frozen silence, at the moment of her defeat, said more than all her lectures about procedures and protocols had ever conveyed. It was the sound of someone finally understanding that power without wisdom is not just worthless, it's dangerous. And in a world where too many people confuse having a little authority with being actually important, that might be the most valuable lesson of all. This story is a work of fiction, inspired by real-world frustrations with bureaucratic overreach, and the difference between legitimate authority and petty officialdom. While the characters and events are fictional, the underlying themes about compassion, common sense, and doing the right thing when it matters most are very real. Any resemblance to actual HOA board members, living or dead, is purely coincidental. Probably.